Welcome to the podcast where mental health is at the core of what we focus on. We strive to develop people like you to maximize who you are and what you've been called to do by sharing tools and resources for better brain health. And now here's your host, Juan Garcia.
Hey everyone, welcome to the podcast. This is your podcast where we focus on mental health and peak performance. And in this episode, we want to begin a series that I want to entitle Cognitive Distortions. Cognitive Distortions. And this episode, we're going to define what that is. We're going to break it down. And I want to also share where we can possibly get these cognitive distortions. Where do they come from? How do we develop them? So forth and so on. And so I just want to lay the foundation for the series. And then as the episodes come along, we're going to go a little bit deeper into what they are specifically, what they look like, and how do they potentially damage our lives. They damage our relationships, they damage career opportunities, they damage so many day-to-day activities that we behave in or we omit in our lives because of it. So I think it's an important series, so stay tuned. If this is the first time that you're kind of tuning in, make sure you subscribe. Cognitive distortions, the term is a psychological term that basically means irrational thinking. And these are thoughts that are irrational in nature, but that have an effect or an impact on our emotions. If you've followed us and you've heard us talk about one of the approaches that we have for helping individuals in their different situations, one of the things that we do use is called cognitive behavioral therapy. It's also known as CBT. And CBT is right now ranked as the most effective types of therapies as it relates to helping with depression, with anxiety, and other mental health concerns that people deal with. And I think the biggest reason is because in CBT, well, at least in my practice, I help individuals identify potential cognitive distortions or these irrational thoughts that are coming in. And what happens is when we identify these thoughts, then we can clearly say, okay, if this is a thought and we can both agree that it's an irrational thought, then now we can do the steps, we can do our due diligence to try to navigate it, find out where it came from, what was the genesis of it, and then now get it out of our system. Because what happens with cognitive distortions is that it becomes the engine for our core belief system. And you and I both know we subscribe to a core belief system. We have beliefs that our lives depend on. For example, one core belief that you may have or that you may subscribe to is that you need to be loved, or you need to be accepted, or you need to be someone that's recognized for your values and your worth. And the reason why that becomes a core value or a core belief is because it drives how you connect with people and how you allow people to be in your life and what degree of involvement people have in your lives because of that one core belief. If you do not have that core belief as part of your belief system, then anyone can come in and out of your life and have no boundaries and have no limits and have no respect. And that's what happens, right? So core beliefs are important. They're a very, very big and important part of our lives. And so if we identify irrational thinking or cognitive distortions in our core belief system, then we can quickly say, this is why I am either living this way, allowing these things to happen. This is why I keep getting myself into these situations, etc., etc. Because remember, there's a cognitive behavioral therapy cycle that I like to share with people, which is there's a thought, there's an emotion, and then there's the behavior. We usually focus on the behavior because that's the obvious thing. That's the one that sticks out. That's the one that is evident. It's out there. We see someone behave, we see what they say, we see what they do, and so we determine that based on what we're seeing, this is fact or this is what it is. And a lot of times what happens is that if we remove the element of the belief system which is driven by emotion, which the underpinning of that emotion is really the thought process, then we're only focusing on behavior. And a lot of the therapies and the approaches that we know of that don't work is because they ignore the root cause or the root issues, not intentionally. It's not something that it happens, going into it that way, but it is the bottom line. It's the reality. We're not getting to the root cause or root issues of what leads to that behavior because there's a process, there's a cycle. The behavior is the last thing, but before the behavior, there's an emotion. And emotions serve as a filter for our thought process. We have these thoughts, and statistics show that we can produce anywhere between 60 to 80,000 thoughts a day. That's a lot of thinking. And if our thoughts are negative or irrational, that's a lot of stinking thinking. Our minds are constantly being bombarded by these thoughts that if they're negative in nature, it bogs us down. It weighs us down because we have the opportunity to add an emotion to it. And usually those emotions that go with it are sad emotions, frustrated emotions, disappointed emotions, angry emotions, jealous emotions, all negative emotions. Again, we're focusing on cognitive distortions or irrational thoughts, which is why the assumption is that these are negative thoughts. And because we can say that they're negative thoughts, then we can add those negative emotions, and which is why the behavior usually is depression or lack of motivation or these bouts of anger where we're expressing ourselves in a very demeaning way, we're degrading people, we're putting people down, all of these things that come about. So those are the behaviors, but again, it has to be connected to an emotional process that's filtering a thought process. So remember the cycle. There's a thought, there's an emotion, there's behavior, there's a thought, there's an emotion, there's behavior, and that's the cycle. When we skip, that's where we get lost in trying to identify what it is that's causing all of this issue. So, recap, cognitive distortions are irrational thoughts. These are thoughts that are bombarding us, and we're thinking about them in a way where we're adding negative emotions. And then when we add negative emotions, we therefore have these behaviors that could get us in trouble. May not be criminal in nature, may not be to that extent, but day to day, they could be behaviors that affect our productivity. They affect our decision making as far as relationships is concerned. And you and I both know that a lot of what we do in life hinges on the relationships that we have. It's amazing how much can drive us or how much can hold us back because of the relationships that we have or the lack thereof. And so this is not a small thing to talk about. This is huge, because the sooner we identify potential cognitive distortions or irrational thoughts, the sooner we can get to the bottom of why eventually or ultimately we're acting the way we're acting, because it's affecting everything. And the filter of emotion is really a big one. So what I want to do is I want to share three possible things that can be the reason why we have these cognitive distortions. Now, we all deal with some type of cognitive distortion in our lives at some point, to different degrees. We all have it because for some reason human nature by default can be negative, can be a little bit pessimistic or skeptic or cynical to some degree. For whatever reason, that's human nature. But my focus in determining the issue of cognitive distortion is when it really becomes a problem emotionally and also behaviorally. So we all deal with some of these cognitive distortions, which we'll get into in the next episode. But my concern for it, and which is why I'm bringing this series, is because many people struggle on a day-to-day basis because of these cognitive distortions, and it affects their daily walk and their daily life. And that's why I want to make sure that we're not only defining it, we're identifying, we're trying to get to the bottom of it. And so here are 3 things that I believe can be a cause of what a cognitive distortion looks like in our lives. Number 1, it could be trauma. I've said before that the brain and the mind are separate but inseparable, and sometimes we go through trauma where there's either physical trauma, where we have what's called a TBI, or traumatic brain injury. My point is that there are traumas that are physical in nature that do affect some of our feelings, feeling down, things like PTSD, things like clinical depression. They're physical traumas that do compound our thinking, our negative thinking, because it either affected our brain in a specific way, or it just brings us to a place where it's traumatic and it's negative in nature. So that would be one reason for cognitive distortions, which is the lowest percentage of statistics that we see of people that suffer from it. Very, very small percentage, but it is a percentage nevertheless. Secondly, I would say is dysfunction in the family. Many of us have grown up in a dysfunctional family. So when we grow up in a dysfunctional family, things like codependency, things like substance abuse, chemical abuse, things like emotional abuse, psychological abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, all of these different types of abuses. And the reason why abuse is the common denominator is because we're talking about a family. And the ideal of a family, for it to be healthy, is because there are children that are depending on adults to raise them a certain way where they get all of their needs met. And it doesn't happen. And so when that doesn't happen, we produce all of these different things that affect us. And it's because of the dysfunction. So dysfunctional families do produce these potentials for people to have irrational thinking. And it's a big one. So that would be a big number of people that suffer from cognitive distortions because of dysfunctional families. And then thirdly, I would say, first is trauma, second is dysfunctional family. Thirdly, I would say it is the lack of emotional intelligence, or EQ. This one also is big because there seems to be a disconnect between our self-awareness and the ability to think in a way where we are more realistic about expectations, things that are possible and things that are just not feasible. There's a disconnect. We don't have a reconciliation of our emotions to those things. Therefore, there's this gap, this chasm that creates a disproportion of our thinking and our emotions. And because there's no reconciliation there, then we just behave without really processing the consequences of it. And I'll get into some of those examples in the next episode, but I just want to lay the foundation because I think a lot of times we do what we do because we don't know better. And in the category of emotional intelligence and there are some episodes that I've done about this. It's that self-awareness where sometimes we don't realize that we have biases, that we have cognitive biases, that we have prejudices, that we have stereotypes, that we have all of these things. And all of those things, if you can look at them from a bullet points perspective, they all fall under the category of expectations. So in other words, if you have a prejudice or a stereotype of something, then that's an expectation that you have. Whether you express it as an expectation, whether you write it down as an expectation, whether you ever thought about it as an expectation, the bottom line is it is an expectation. And so when your expectation of that, whatever that is not met, then you have a cognitive distortion that starts to develop in your thought process that then has to filter through your emotions, and then eventually there's a behavior that's attached to it. So I hope all of that is making sense, because it is so important to get a hold of what it is to believe in something that's irrational, to have an irrational thought. Now, obviously, we don't wake up in the morning and say, you know what, I'm going to have some irrational thoughts. No one does that. And a lot of people may have pushback and say, you know what, this is a nice, cool little episode, but it's offensive for you to say that I have irrational thoughts. Yeah, that's very possible. And I respect that. The bottom line is, if you follow me through this process, this series, you're going to be able to identify some of the thinking that you're going to have to say, yeah, I actually do that. And you probably never knew that it was an irrational thought, a cognitive distortion. So hang in there with me. This is not a judgment. This is not something to point fingers. As I said, we all have some type of cognitive distortions throughout our lives. The problem is making sure that it's not affecting our daily life and our emotional and awareness of all of it as it relates to our daily walk and the way we interact with people and relationships, because that's where we see a lot of the issues. And then that's where depression comes in, that's where anxiety comes in, that's when all of these mental health challenges come in, which is where I want to make sure that I'm helping as many people as I can, and as many people as these platforms allow me to get the word out there and the information out there, so that we are empowered, we are equipped, and we are minding our mental health, because that is super important. So I hope that's been helpful. Laying down the foundation, cognitive distortions, they are irrational thoughts that we kind of entertain, and our emotions filter it, and depending on what that emotion is, we have behavior as a result. And I want to make sure that we are aware of these things so that we intercept it. And then as we go into these episodes, I'll teach you how to do that in a healthy way and maintain your mind cognitive distortion free. All right, so hang in there. Stick with me as we continue to provide information on mental health and peak performance through this podcast, Mind Yours. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you on the next episode.
Thank you for tuning into our podcast. For more information, visit our website at juangarciaenterprises.com. Our host, Juan Garcia, is available for speaking, coaching, and one-on-one counseling. You can email us at info@juangarciaenterprises.com. Until next time, remember, we only have one mind, so mind yours.